Okay, folks, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. We're going to get started. Thank you to everyone who is joining us. We have a few announcements as everyone joins. First, we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during the session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen in Whova, and the chat window is where you can interact with other attendees. And we kindly ask you to keep your microphone and cameras off during the presentations and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we're ready to get started, and I'm going to hand it over to our speakers to begin. Matt, you can take it away.
Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. We've got a set of interesting talks. This is our last session of talks, and then after that there'll be a fire circle, and we hope that you'll join us for that. And with that, I say Sharon Hood, please take it away.
Hi, everyone. So hold on just a second. There we go. Well, thanks for joining us today. I'm going to talk about a recent study and some new results that we have about some longer-term tree mortality and growth after fire. And just want to acknowledge my co-authors here that have done a ton of work with Charlotte Reed, Barbara Bentz, and Joel Egan. So we typically think about the outcome of a tree after fire as either it survives or it dies. And that's really useful for a lot of our modeling purposes and different management. But we know in actuality that it's more complex than that. So if the tree survives after fire, its survival and growth depends on a whole host of factors, including the level of fire injury, the bark beetle pressure in an area, and if that tree is attacked, its local competition both before and after the fire can greatly affect growth, and as well as both pre and post fire climate. So I was thinking about this a lot, doing tree mortality work and talking with managers that they were starting to have more questions about, so yeah, my tree's going to survive, but what is it actually going to do over time? What was my residual forest going to look like in 10, 20 years after a fire? And thinking about this cartoon here, it's like, of course, trees have these different trajectories of growth. And you know, if there's severe fire injury, it might die immediately over a fire or kind of after the first few years. Kind of as I'm showing here with this orange line. But then there's a whole range of how lower levels of injury might affect long-term growth. Is it going to be slightly decreased compared to unburned trees, or maybe it's actually increased relative to before the fire? And so again, that depends on its competitive environment and site conditions before the fire, and also how the fire changes our competitive environment. So if a tree survives and all its neighbors burn, you know, that can be a big growth release, but how might that interact with the fire injury? Those are things we don't have a lot of understanding about. Also, a big unknown is whether that tree is attacked by bark beetles, to where a tree with moderate growth and moderate levels of fire injury could be attacked and then die, and it might have survived its fire injuries alone. So thinking about these questions made us realize that we actually had quite a few sites where we could start to explore these questions about what is the long-term outcome of trees after fire. And so based on a lot of research, I had put in Idaho and Montana, Wyoming and Utah, and then Susan Pritchard kindly shared her data from the tripod fire in Washington. We had 8 sites where we had put in fixed area plots within 1 year after the fire, tagged all these trees. So that meant we could go back to them. And we knew the level of fire caused injury for each of these trees, whether their level of crown scorch, their level of cambium kill, if they had been attacked by bark beetles. And we tracked mortality for at least 3 years after the fire for each of these 8 sites. So we were able to get funding to go back to these sites and look at the outcome, the post-fire growth and mortality or tree status anywhere from 14 to 20 years post-fire. So the main objectives of our study was, when we went back to remeasure these plots, there's many conifer species across these 8 sites, so that we could remeasure those plots and look at long-term post-fire mortality and the causes of the mortality, and also look at snag retention. So those, if the tree died, how long does that snag remain standing? And then we added quite a bit of an intensive plot on top of our remeasurement, where we, for ponderosa pine and Douglas fir trees, we cored those trees to use tree rings to quantify post-fire growth as a function of the fire-caused injury, bark beetles, the neighborhood competition, and also pre-fire growth. So this is a schematic of what our sites look like. The actual plot size changed a little from study to study, but in general, we have 10th acre or 0.04 hectare plots, and that's shown in the gray shaded circle, where we could go back to each of these gray smaller circles indicates a tree. So we could go back and check the status of those trees. And then for our extra data, for our competition plots, we identified the 6 nearest ponderosa and Douglas fir, as shown here with these black circles, closest to plot center, and cored those trees, and also collected a lot of data on the local competition, to where we measured the all trees within 11 meters of the focal tree, and it's the distance from the focal tree, its azimuth, and tree size. One kind of drawback of this study, every time we're leveraging past data, nothing is perfect. And we, in our case, because these plots were put in for looking at immediate post-fire mortality, we didn't have control plots. So we added those control plots where we did this local neighborhood competition in burned area, or in unburned areas, as close as we could get to our burn plots, so that we could look at those the tree growth, and using tree rings for the baseline patterns of growth, and be able to subtract out that, or remove that signal, to be able to look at what the actual fire did to growth. Okay, so I want to share some initial results I have with you. We just finished data collection on 7 of the 8 sites. We didn't get to that tripod fire in Washington because a fire in 2021 prevented us from getting, or actually getting to those sites. So that's on the docket for this coming summer. But we have a lot of the results for the 7 other sites. So you can see this is here when in northern Montana on the Moose Fire, and from a plot where things have changed quite a bit. It was pretty cool to go back to these sites after so long since the fire. So these are the initial patterns of tree mortality. So for simplicity, I've just lumped 14 to 20 years post-fire in one measurement for now, but we have a lot more to do, obviously. All my slides from now on are the species are arranged by an order of increasing bark thickness. And so what pops out here to me is that, again, most of the mortality for most species occurred in those first 3 years after fire. And that's generally what we expected based on existing research. But there has been quite a bit of mortality from year 3 to 14 to 20 years post-fire. And I've put those numbers here in parentheses on the right. So our white bark pine and Douglas fir had over, and lodgepole pine had over 20% mortality in the long term. So that surprised me a little bit, just to have to see how much additional mortality occurred. Looking at how that relates to fire injury, here again, it's showing species by increasing order of bark thickness, and then by the crown scorch. So this was the crown scorch right after the fire. And here I'm only showing trees that survived until year 3 and what their status was in 2021. And here, I think this came out in some of our the talks yesterday, that if you attended the session, that longer term delayed mortality doesn't seem to be really influenced by crown scorch. So if you have high levels of crown scorch, you're probably going to die the first 3 years of the fire. And these lower levels of crown scorch we see here don't really influence delayed mortality after year 3. There's some different, maybe with subalpine fir, but in generally, the crown scorch doesn't seem to be a good predictor of mortality if you survive that initial 3 years. This is cambium kill rating now on the right. This is where we measured 4 quadrants at the very base of the tree to see if the cambium was alive or dead. So 4 equals all 4 cambium samples were dead. And here, that basal injury does seem to be a better indicator of if the tree can live or die in that long term. Again, after year 3, that we see this pretty consistent pattern of the trees that died had higher levels of basal injury relative to the trees that survived. So what was killing these trees? Here I've got it just separated by biotic and abiotic agents. No surprise, some of these really aggressive bark beetles like mountain pine beetle and Douglas fir beetle caused a lot of mortality in the pines and Douglas fir. And by abiotic, I've just lumped either those fire cause injuries or mechanical injuries, like from a tree falling and crushing one of the trees, wind throw, kind of a whole host of the kind of abiotic factors. And those seem to be driven or be higher in these species with thinner bark. As far as the snag status, this is, so here it's all trees, not just the trees that survived through year 3. So a tree that died anywhere from immediately after the fire to up to 20 years post-fire. Again, obviously we have a lot more details to work through with these, but this is the overall pattern. And you could see that white bark pine and western larch are the only species that have over 50% of the trees, or snags, excuse me, left standing after the fire. So again, that's somewhat expected, but we don't have actually a lot of information on snag status post-fire. So this will be really useful, I think, for some of the different models that look at predict snag dynamics after fire. Okay, so we have 3 chronologies that are ready to go so far of our current 7 that we've collected all the tree cores. So here I'm showing one of the fires and time on the x-axis, and the heavy black line is the year of the fire. On the y-axis is basal area increment, or the radial growth, how fast that tree is growing annually. Our blue lines are ponderosa pine, and the orange lines are Douglas fir. And So the solid lines are burned trees, and what you can see is right after the fire, both Douglas fir and ponderosa pine growth declined. Ponderosa pine kind of steadily increased in growth relative to the unburned trees that are shown by the dashed lines. But our Douglas fir, after that decline, it seemed to recover, but really it just started tracking the same growth patterns as the unburned trees. So we were really excited when we first, this was the first chronology we developed and plotted these results, like, oh, this is really cool. And then the next chronology was a wildfire where we only have Douglas fir in those plots. And here there doesn't seem to be a big change in growth caused from the fire, at least at the for our whole sample level. Again, we have a lot of details to examine. And also looking at a prescribed fire in Western Montana, we don't really see a strong pattern or any pattern really that the fire affected the long-term growth trajectory relative to unburned trees. So with that, again, these are the initial results. We just finished collecting all these data in 2020 and 2021. So there's still a lot more work to do about how exactly that competition and fire injury interact with site productivity and also climate. But again, really our take home, what we hope that this results of the study will do is really extend that dichotomy of whether the tree lives or dies to really thinking about these long-term patterns and ultimately forest resilience over time after fire. And with that, I just had an awesome crew for the past 2 years that did a ton of work getting back to these sites, and want to thank them and funding from Forest Health Protection. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has some. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sharon. It's amazing what you can learn from data. All right. There's no questions in the chat that I see. Anyone have any question? If you do, just unmute yourself and fire away.
Hey Sharon, this is Susan Pritchard. I just wanted to let you know I'm really excited that tripod's still potentially on your field sampling list, and I live really close to the tripod. Be happy to go out with the crew and try to refine those sites because I know that is sometimes a challenge. So looking forward to learning more about this project.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Susan, and thanks for collaborating with us. I think it'll be awesome to be able to get out there hopefully this year. So, because it sounds like not all the plots reburned.
Right, and the good news around the tripod is that we've had so much burning, there's very little to burn again right now. So hopefully you won't be thwarted by yet another wildfire, but knock on wood.
Yeah, never know. Right.
Yeah. So Alina, I see, do you have a question?
Sharon, did it look like Larch had the lowest level of delayed post-fire mortality? Is that correct?
I printed out my, yes, it has 10%. And yeah, our Western larch is very resistant to fire, and it doesn't have a primary bark beetle. So that can really, I think, help that kind of the survival outlook.
I'm just thinking about, the kind of ranking of species in terms of fire resistance, and of this is one more, both the bark beetle and the just how much mortality happens over the long term without beetles as one more line of evidence of where those rankings should be. Because I've seen some evidence where they don't rank larch that high because its bark isn't necessarily thicker. So it's nice to see that here.
Yeah, well, with at least in FOFEM, the bark thickness equations for ponderosa, Douglas fir, and Western larch are all the same. So, but yeah, Western larch can develop thick bark really quickly, and it can survive high levels of crown scorch because it it loses its needles annually anyway. So it doesn't seem to be as sensitive to that needle loss if the buds survive. Some of the differences that Morgan talked about in his talk yesterday.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for that. We're at 9:20 and we'll move ahead if you can stop sharing. Great. And Chad Hoffman, please go ahead. Can't hear you, Chad, if you're talking. I'm not sure if you are.
There we go. Can you hear me now, Matt?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in. This has been a really fun session so far, and I'm looking forward to talks the rest of the day. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about linking 3D fire behavior predictions to fire effects, and with a focus on really crown scorch and consumption. And before I begin, just thank my co-authors who frankly have done most of the work up to this point. I'm also going to start off with stating a few obvious things. Fire effects are important. Everyone here probably, hopefully, knows that. They drive a number of ecological processes and the goods and services we get from forests. But there's a lot of questions that remain. And so a host of papers have been published last several years talking about how do we quantify fire effects better? How do we predict tree mortality? Many by people in this session. And at least my kind of take when I look through those papers is two things jump out. One, we need a better mechanistic understanding of fire effects. And two, we need to really think about how we're going to model fire effects. And in particular, how do we deal with this heterogeneity of fire behavior and fire effects at a number of different scales? And that's kind of going to be a focus throughout this talk, is this notion of heterogeneity and how do we deal with it. So the next state the obvious things is just, I'll be talking about scorch and consumption. Consumption is literally foliage and buds being consumed. These things get converted to other chemicals. And then scorch is the death through heat of these foliage. And this may or may not include bud kill. And Morgan Varner's paper earlier this year did a good job of talking about crown scorch versus crown kill. For the purpose of my talk, at least right now, I'm gonna just assume I never read Morgan's paper, and we're just gonna call crown scorch and assume scorch means death. We'll revisit this kind of later in the talk. Okay, so for those who aren't really familiar with how we predict crown scorch, I'm gonna present the Van Wagner model. There's a host of models, but Van Wagner is one that's been around a long time. It's one that is commonly used, and Van Wagner actually produced 3 separate crown scorch models. They're all based on predicting fire line intensity as estimated by Byram, and that's a fairly important idea in the modeling world, that it's Byram's fire line intensity. These were based on 13 experiments in Canada. They were all strip head fires or single head fires on flat ground with relatively low wind speeds. So wind speeds on these experiments range from about 0.6 to 1.3 meters per second. What's really important about these is these equations ended up being used in a number of common modeling systems like FFE, FES, and Behave. And there's been some, alterations and other equations used throughout the years. Regardless of the ones we use, there's really limited model evaluation, and there's a number of known limitations, primarily that they're not spatially explicit, and they don't include interacting fire lines. So if we're using these for a prescribed fire, for example, we can't distinguish between strip head fires at 30 feet versus 200 feet apart. They also don't tell us a lot about, if a tree's in an opening versus in a big clump. These tools don't really have the ability to give us those kinds of differences. So again, this notion of spatial variability and how do we best capture that is a known limitation of these tools. And, Marty Alexander in a recent paper, highlighted that because of these known limitations and uncertainties, we, especially in the US fire modeling systems, which introduce some other uncertainties, we we might not expect a lot of predictive accuracy. So over the last 20 years or so, one of the things that's really driven a lot of fire modeling has been the development of these coupled fire atmospheric models. So things like FireTech or WFDS or WRF Fire, things like that. And I'll focus on FireTech and WFDS in particular, in part because these models allow us to represent the fuels complex in 3 dimensions. They account for fuels, topography, and atmospheric interactions. And so they also, I guess before I get any further, they also explicitly account for radiation and convection. So when we're modeling with these tools, we get 3-dimensional predictions. We're accounting for the heat transfer processes we believe are important for crown fire effects. And so they just give us a lot more detail. However, to date, the models have mostly been used for fire behavior studies, and that's what they were primarily designed for. So studies that predicted rate of spread, fire line intensity, things of that nature. Some other studies have focused on canopy consumption, primarily as a measure of severity. And a few studies have recently tried to link consumption to tree mortality, primarily through really basic rules, like if a tree has 5% consumption, let's assume it dies. So not a whole lot of real tight connections to fire effects, and nothing using crown scorch, and really not a lot of linkages up to this date, just a handful of studies. All right, so with that in mind, the objectives today are just to walk you through some work we've been doing where we're trying to better link these 3D fire models to fire effects. So I'm going to spare you guys a lot of discussion about how the data looks and transforming data and all of that, but we'll just walk through the process. I'll show you some preliminary model evaluation results and really talk about the next steps with hope that, you know, people in this room get excited. And the ultimate point of this talk is just to initialize some conversations about how do we use these tools and this new approach in more informative ways. All right, so currently, when we think about how we estimate crown scorch, we take a model like Behave, we give it fuels, weather, topography, predict things like rate of spread, fuel consumption. There's a lot of equations in the background. Ultimately, this gives us that fire line intensity. So that fire line intensity then goes into something like Van Wagner 73 to give us crown scorch. We link those crown scorch with tree size, species, et cetera. We get mortality. What we're really proposing to do is eliminate that first step of using Behave with a physics-based model. So this does a number of things for us. First, we can include things like ignition techniques. We still have weather, fuels, topography, but rather than doing rate of spread prediction and then estimating residence time and fuel consumed, we're going to directly output things like the heat flux, the temperatures, and the consumption of the fuel. And so we're going to get rid of Behave, replace it with a physics model. Then we're going to get rid of Van Wagner, and we're going to replace it for right now with some kind of really simple rule about 60 degrees C results in scorch. And then for consumption, we're just going to predict that natively in these tools. So we're not relying on a suite of empirical models. We're really simplifying the equation set down. All right, so I've talked a little bit about this notion of 3D vegetation and how that's really important. I just wanted to kind of show you guys what it looks like. So down in the bottom right here is a picture of a WFDS simulation. The black squares are showing the grid in which we're making predictions. So when we create these fuels, we can use a variety of data sources, LiDAR, aerial, terrestrial, field data. We can make stuff up. That's obviously the easiest way to go in many cases. But what we do is we either represent fuels as either objects. So we say there's a tree at this location and this is what the tree looks like. Or we represent voxel by voxel. So we take each of those squares and we say there's fuel here and here's what that fuel looks like. So just as a starting point to build a forest or rangeland in these models, we have these kind of two options. All right, so regardless of how we do that, what we really are trying to do here is take each of those voxels we're going to associate that voxel with an object. So this is an object-based approach, primarily focused on trees at the moment. So we're going to say this particular voxel is associated with this tree. We give it a number. For each of those trees, we then can calculate a series of things. Percent consumed is directly output. So we can do that by volume consumed, mass consumed. We can do the height at which consumption occurred, things of that nature. And then we're going to try to output a scorch estimate as well. And right now we can do that one of two ways. We can use the temperature data. So in this particular case, I'll be talking about FireTech. FireTech provides an estimate of the solid fuel temperature in each voxel. So we can look at that temperature and we can use a simple rule like 60 degrees C means that it got scorched. Or we could build this off of heat flux data. So that's important because, say, if we go back to Morgan's idea about scorch versus kill, say for a bud, we might want to add heat flux data in there and link it to some other models, like a conductive model, because it's a larger object. Ultimately, we then take this output for each tree, we link it back to our input data. So what is the XY location? What was the species, the diameter breast height, etc. And we get something out that looks like a CSV file, essentially. So we have the tree location, the species, all of these variables we calculate. And this allows us to then kind of look spatially at this data. We can get around some of those known assumptions. We have spatial estimates within a tree, as well as spatial estimates across stands or landscapes. And then ultimately, we can connect this to bud kill models or tree mortality models as well. All right, so that's kind of the process we used, what the input-output flow looks like. And now I'm just going to kind of highlight, we did 4 test simulations. I was joking yesterday with a colleague about how I have a presentation and I have an N of 4. I don't think I've ever given a presentation with an N of 4 before. But this is just kind of our first attempt to see how well the models are performing. So I'm going to show 4 test simulations. They span across a range of intensities. They have mean wind speeds, similar to those in the Van Wagner experiments. We assume that crown scorch occurred when solid temperatures reached 60 degrees C for 1 second. These are all surface fires. We use the burner method in FireTech. So what I mean by that is we tell the model what the surface fire looks like. We have the surface fire spread at a known rate with a known intensity. It gives us a lot of control to compare to the experimental data. All right, here's the 4 simulations I'm going to show. The first 3 are all based on Van Wagner experiments in Jack Pine. They have about 1,600 trees per hectare, 20 meters tall, pretty high crown base height. Couple different intensities. So we held rate of spread the same. We held the fire depth the same based on some of the Van Wagner estimates in his experiments. And then essentially you can think about these first 3 as lowering intensity through having less surface fuels in the simulation. And then we did a 4th simulation. It looks a little bit different. The trees are a little bit smaller and the crown base height is a little bit lower. We had to change it up a little bit because we're using solid temperature. If crown base heights aren't present, if there's no solid fuel present, we can't get a temperature estimate. And so we had to make the crowns a little bit smaller just to get some data out. All right, so here's the 4 points relative to Van Wagner. I apologize about the terrible units. I just pulled this graph from Van Wagner and did the conversions. Overall, what we find in our pretty preliminary results here is that on average, we're about a 2-meter difference in our predictions for scorch height compared to the Van Wagner equation. There does seem to be a little bit of trend if you look at the data where we underpredict at lower intensities. It's not clear why this is happening yet. So we need to do more comparisons at these lower intensities. Also, just to highlight, our grid resolution is somewhere between 1.5 to 2 meters in the crown. So being off by 2 meters means that we're 1 pixel away from it. And so we don't have a lot of ability to even say if we're off, if it's, say we were off by 0.5 meters, we couldn't even really detect that very well in the model. So this is really encouraging. It seems that FireTech's given us pretty good output. We do need to do some grid resolution testing to see what that's looking like. And then, to be honest, also looking at the sensitivity to flame depth, rate of spread, and resonance time, you know, we can produce fires with the same intensity by altering flame depth or rate of spread or resonance time or some combination. So it's not clear if maybe our underprediction is due to a particular scenario, like having a fairly low resonance time or a fairly narrow flame depth. Thanks, Matt. So some next steps there is just to check that. All right, so kind of try to wrap this up, save room if there's questions. Our preliminary results are really encouraging so far. About a 2 meter error, it's slightly larger than a single pixel off. What I really want to do is just highlight, you know, this method we've developed really gets over many of the limitations of the current modeling system. So we get spatially explicit predictions of scorch and consumption, both within a tree and across the stands. We can get estimates along the entire fire perimeter, so we can pick up head versus back versus flank fire differences without trying to rely on separate empirical models. We can natively incorporate various firing techniques, ignition patterns that are used in prescribed burning. So this provides us a lot of opportunity, especially to connect with prescribed fire, which is the point actually of why we started doing this work. And then, you know, we also can put in terrain. So in that Alexander and Cruz paper in 2011, they talked a lot about, you know, how terrain, interactions between wind, terrain, and fire can influence crown scorch. And again, we can natively include that in the fire behavior models and thus in our predictions. So we're kind of moving towards more model evaluation, some sensitivity analysis. The next steps, we're actually been working on linking these directly, our scorch and consumption outputs to tree mortality models, and writing up a little code and script to be able to do that. And then, you know, as people develop these new scorch models based on temperatures or heat fluxes, you know, the idea is to have a system where we can take those, dump it into our model pretty rapidly and be able to keep up with all the new science and technology that's being developed. So with that, I think I'll take any questions people have.
Hey, thanks a lot, Chad. So there are no questions in the chat right now. Anyone on that just wants to unmute and ask? We've got a couple minutes.
I've got a question, Matt. Thanks, Chad. It's cool that you're gonna be able to add crown scorch into the models. So I was wondering what your thoughts are. Like you showed the graph with comparing FireTech's output with Van Wagner's scorch height, but it's my understanding is that model is pretty. It hasn't really been evaluated very well. So I mean, are there other data sets that are out there that we could rely on? Maybe, or that means maybe FireTech's not off. It seemed like it was mostly developed for Jack Pine on flat ground.
Yeah, so that's a good question, Sharon. I mean, we chose that one to start because Van Wagner had some pretty good estimates of fire behavior. And it's also a fairly simple system. So, you know, it's not a whole lot of variation tree to tree. I mean, it's fairly plantation-y looking in the pictures. So it was just a good place to start because it was simple and easy. And it's one of the few that I know that has at least decent fire behavior output that we could pull from. Obviously, there could be other ones to compare to, you know, as we move forward. But as we get into more complex systems, that can be pretty tough.
It just seems, yeah, there's more room to validate those models. So yeah, but it does seem like a good starting point. So thanks.
Okay, let's see. I saw Morgan. Were you on? Let me just if you have a quick question, we could go for that.
Well, yeah, a real quick one. That was cool, Jad. Because you use the Van Wagner, you could do, 60 for foliage, ignition temperature for consumption, and then we could measure that stuff for jack pine for buds. So it seems like there is a way forward, and sticking with the jack pine example might be a cool one to be able to look at that full spectrum of crown injury.
Oh yeah, that's a good point, Mark. We actually didn't look at the consumption or comparing to the ignition equations. Scott Ritter did some work with WFDS on that recently and found some good agreement with that model, but we haven't done that with FireTech yet. That would be a nice addition though.
That was really cool. Thank you.
Also, can I comment that all the people who ask me questions are ones who work on this project,
Sorry about that. All right, thanks a lot, Chad.
Thanks.
I got more questions too later. So anyway, we're at 9:41. Sorry, Matt, jumping into your time just a little bit. So Matt, please go ahead. Matt Reilly.
Great, thanks. And I'm having connection issues. Hopefully y'all can hear me. Okay,
It was okay.
So you can hear me? Okay.
We can hear you,
I'm gonna
Matt.
go for it. Okay, thank you. Can't see I'm just gonna go for it here. So anyways, thanks for having me, Sharon and Morgan and Matt for organizing, and I'm excited to share some new results today. This is kind of a follow-up to a poster I gave a couple of years ago. And we're going to zoom out a bit and look at remote sensing of delayed mortality. Had a lot of help from folks. Young and Aaron here with the Forest Service and Corvallis have been sort of the remote sensing part, Google Earth Engine wizards, and Micah, Jane, Joe, Phil, and Luis have provided field data, which is really what I've been sort of lacking to move forward with this. And I don't talk sizing up the elephant in the room, and today I'm just really going to show some results, share some maps and things like that. We're not quite ready to tackle the elephant. So I think certainly in this room, delayed mortality is not an elephant by any means, and I think the fire and tree mortality days is sort of a testament to that. And we've heard a lot in these different presentations this week about the multiple potential mechanisms and ecological effects of delayed mortality. I have here a figure from some of Phil's work looking at temporal patterns where we see this high uptick in mortality immediately following, and then it sort of slows down over time, but also this unique component where the big trees start to blink out a little bit later. And so in terms of this elephant, I think y'all working at sort of the individual level have really been sort of feeling it out at a different scale. And today, what I'm going to really try and tackle is this lack of information on sort of the overall extent of delayed mortality following fire.
Yeah, we lost you there, Ryan, or excuse me, Matt. Your screen.
Matt, do you just want to carry on a little bit while Matt Reilly tries to get his connectivity back?
Yeah, why don't we just hold on, see if we can get him back. So So Chad, I'll ask the question I had about your talk. So it looks like you're developing a nice tool for exploring just, mechanism, just how fire line interaction, sort of different kinds of plumes, affect scorch. And I'm just wondering if you, how much at the end of the day do you think you can predict, just say knowing things like fuels, weather, and making sort of general fire behavior predictions? I mean, how predictable really is ground scorch at this point? That's what I'm wondering. Maybe you can predict a distribution, and that's the best you can do. Not hearing Chad.
No.
Chad, do you want to go ahead and unmute and answer that question?
So, sorry, Matt, could you repeat that? My sound cut out there for a second.
Yeah, so I'm just, you're developing a nice tool for looking at a whole range of fire behavior and plume characteristics and effects on scorch. And at the end of the day, like how much can you really predict if you don't know the details about fire behavior? And is the best thing you could do maybe a distribution of ground scorch given initial conditions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think a distributional approach could be kind of interesting. It's just so tough with some of these sites. There's been a whole session, there was a whole session earlier in the week talking about some of the results and sensitivity of these physics-based models. And, it's clear that getting good data for these is challenging. So I think as we do more experiments, collect more data, we can, maybe, I guess like what I'm getting at is maybe we need to rethink, like you're suggesting, is rethink what evaluation looks like and our comfort level with uncertainty, in these predictions.
Yeah. Hey, thanks. Right. Hey, Matt, can you go ahead and relaunch? Yeah, can you try to relaunch your talk?
Yeah, I'm back. Really sorry about this. I'm gonna, can you see it now?
Not yet, Matt. I'm also going to turn your video off to see if that helps with connectivity.
Matt, we're supposedly looking at your screen, but it's black.
Yeah. So at some point we're gonna have to in about 10 minutes, I guess. We're gonna have to start moving on. So Matt, I don't know what you want to do. If you were willing to send your like a PDF of your PowerPoint around and to the organizers or the other speakers, that could be great. Or if you want to just encapsulate your talk, just talking about it without your slides, that would that could be helpful as well.
Matt, I can share Matt Reilly's presentation if you just want to let me know what slide to go to, and then Matt Reilly, if you just want to start with camera off, just talking about it, and just let me know when to advance, I can do that.
Okay.
All right, sharing now. What slide, Matt, do you want me to be on? Matt Reilly, try to unmute yourself. You're in here twice. Just make sure you're talking to the right, on the right account. Matt Dickinson, is there someone else that could speak to any of Matt Reilly's presentation that's on the panel today?
Yeah, I don't know, but if there is anyone on, please speak up. Okay. So I think shortly here, maybe we can just all take a quick break and come back at the top of the hour.
I see Matt's on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you
Okay,
just stop your video, Matt, and then maybe that'll help your connectivity, and then we can carry on with your presentation. Is this the proper
Okay.
slide? We seem to have lost him again. Sorry, folks. Matt, if you can hear us, you can go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing my screen. I'm gonna just sort of bomb through this with what time I have left. So basically, we came up with a way to incorporate delayed mortality into these burn severity maps. And the approach is really, really simple. We use what I call this minimum NBR composite. And this figure here I have demonstrates it. Usually folks use the year before and the year after and difference those. And what we do is we basically go through the 5 years of the stack that follows the fire and pull out the minimum NBR.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think this is working very well. So let's take a break till the top of the hour. I'm sorry, Matt and Matt Reilly. So let's take a break and reconvene right at the top of the hour with Duncan Lutes and our talks on decision support. So thank you. Hey, Duncan.
Hey, Matt.
How are you?
Doing all right.
Good. If you wanted to, you could put your talk up. Yeah, it looks good.
Great.
Great. Are you on, Ryan?
I'm on. Yep. We can go
Okay.
ahead and get started. Thanks,
Okay,
Matt.
great. Yeah, all right. So yeah, bummer about the technology problems. We've got a couple talks on decision support that I know a bunch of us are looking forward to. So with that, Duncan, please go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Matt. So, and thanks everybody for joining. I just wanted to give a little update on some things that we're working on with the first order fire effects model. And mostly that's for this talk, it's just making it a little bit easier to run FOFEM at landscape scales. So I think most people know what FOFEM is. By just a little background, it's a desktop application. It's pretty easy to use. It's fairly simple. It's used a lot by the managers, and it's used to look at 4 basic effects at the plot or point scale. It's fuel consumption, then directly related to that are smoke emissions, soil heating, and then the topic really today is tree mortality. So there were some things that kind of happened that made this idea of producing or putting together SpatialFOFEM more likely a little bit of convergence of things. One is we had some products that came out, the land fire remap of the FCCS fuel beds for all the United States, which is and now includes much more than the original FCCS, 200 or 300 FCCS fuel beds. There are thousands now. And then more importantly for the tree mortality is the development of the tree map by Reilly and her authors. And this is for the Conterminous US. It's 30-meter resolution raster map of basically tree lists for each cell in the Conterminous US. And then on the application side, we had the Interagency Fuel Treatment Division Decision Support System. And when IFTDIS came out, we knew that it was going to be a tool for managers for fuels treatment planning, analysis, and that kind of thing. And being able to run FOFEM rather than just on a point, be able to run it within a project would be useful. And then finally, Chuck McHugh came to me and said, FlamMap, now with the tree list, FlamMap could really, we could put FOFEM in FlamMap so that we could do fire effects on the spatial scale within the FlamMap tool. And I'll talk a little bit more about why FlamMap is useful. But the point is that all of these things sort of came together in the last few years, and it really seemed to make good sense to produce a version of SpatialFOFEM. Wanted to talk a little bit about tree mortality that's in FOFEM, just the desktop application. There are 4 basic groups of logistic regression equations. The first one is the Ryan and Amon model, which uses species, bark thickness, and crown scorch. And I will acknowledge that, there have been some concern or recognition that bark thickness equations in FOFEM probably aren't all that great, and we could use some improvements there. So I'll put out a call later for any assistance we can get in producing FOFEM, but there's one. The next set of equations are the ones that Sharon's put together that have species DBH and crown scorch. So basically the same as the Ryan and Amon, but we use DBH instead of bark thickness. Then again, another set of equations that Sharon put together, which includes the cambium kill rating and the impact of beetles. And then finally are the bull chart equations that were produced by Tara Kaiser for the eastern deciduous species, 10 eastern deciduous species. So those are all in FOFEM, but in SpatialFOFEM, we only use the crown scorch equations that Sharon did and that Ryan and Amon did. And so the inputs for that we use for that equation are flame length. And you can designate one flame length for an entire landscape, or you can produce a flame length geotiff. So you have a whole layer of flame lengths. Another geotiff would be the tree list. So it's just a clip of the tree map. Then you provide a list of desired species. There could be a whole bunch of species in any particular cell in the tree map. And so you provide the list of species and then a set of diameter classes for determining the mortality. So SpatialFOFEM then calculates the probability of mortality in each landscape cell. So we're just running FOFEM on each cell across the landscape. And we calculate crown scorch as a function of the flame length and the crown ratio. So flame length could be something that you just know intuitively, or you could run a model like FlameMap, for instance, and get the flame length layer right out of FlameMap. The crown ratio is part of the tree map data. So in the lower left there, there's the grid is just one particular tree list from the tree map. So you can see the species diameter, height, crown ratio, and the tree density. And then on the pretend landscape there on the right is for each cell, we know what the tree map ID is. So we know what the tree list is. We know what the flame length is, so then we can calculate the scorch height. And for each individual record in that tree map ID tree list, we can calculate the probability of mortality. So there are 2 basic outputs. One is this CSV file that this is a summary of all the cells on the landscape. So you can see starting on the left are the species and the 3 classes that I picked. And again, you can pick any classes that you want for DBH. It will produce the average DBH, average height, average crown ratio for everything in that class, and then average flame length. And I just used one static flame length for the entire simulation here. Pre-fire, post-fire killed trees per acre, the number of acres that had that particular species and size class on it, and then the total pre, post, and killed number of trees on that landscape. And finally, on the right is the average probability of mortality for each individual species and diameter class combination. And you can see that, they're intuitive, and the small trees tend to have a higher probability of mortality, and that the last 3 rows there are lodgepole pine, not very fire resistant. That tends to have a higher probability of mortality than the other more fire resistant ones, especially larch and the ponderosa pine. So in the second one is the geotiff, so that you can look at the pre, post, and percent mortality or probability of mortality across the landscape. So this is a map of the tree list, all those different 30 by 30 meter cells. And this particular, in the upper sort of right corner of that box, is pointing at one cell, and that is the tree map ID 38,302. If we look just at the, this is the pre-fire trees per acre of the 4 to 8 inch larch. It's 114. Post-fire is 105. And then probability mortality is about 8% in that particular cell for those trees, based on the distribution of trees, tree diameter and crown ratios within that 4 to 8 inch class for the larch. So pretty straightforward there. The availability is on the Fire Modeling Services Framework, which I think Reggie's going to talk about that in the next talk. What's nice about this is it provides a service so that you can get a clip of the tree map and then run the simulation right on the service and get all of the geotiff outputs, and then you could use them in your own GIS. It's not up on the Fire Lab website yet, but it will be eventually. There's the desktop version, and of course you have to provide your own tree map if you're going to do that. And then eventually we're going to have this mortality component of FOFEM in FlamMap. Right now, it only has the consumption and emissions in FlamMap. So I just want to say thanks to a number of people. Forest Service, Fire and Aviation Management have provided funding for FOFEM for a number of years. FOFEM's been around since the mid-90s, and FNAM has been supporter all the time. Or most of that time. The Office of Wildland Fire, the Fire Lab, and the Fire Fuel and Smoke Science Program, the Fire Modeling Institute. And then I have 3 great programmers who really have put this all together. Stu, Hans, and Larry have all done a really great job. I would just, as the temptation said, I'm not too proud to beg. If you have ideas or data or study results that can help improve FOFEM, I'd love to hear about it. Sharon, I think, would like to hear about it. And as an example, Tara Kaiser came to me and said, hey, FOFEM doesn't work very well with some of the species in the, in the East, but we have some data and we could develop some equations. And so that's how that all came about, was that she recognized a need. She came to me and said, we can fix this. And Matt, working with Matt on some soil heating stuff, recognizing the model doesn't work. The bottom line is that, tree mortality is pretty complex, and Alina sort of alluded to this yesterday, that there are a lot of different inputs that you could use to predict the mortality of trees. And just in this, in this session, I've heard about crowding and drought stress and cat faces and that kind of thing. So there are even more that we can put in. We're simplifying this complex process, and sometimes it just doesn't work very well. So any predictive variables that we can include, into FOFEM to make tree mortality predictions better, I'm happy to hear about them. And so I encourage folks, if you have ideas, I've already reached out to Tucker, but if other folks have ideas for improving FOFEM, let me or Sharon know. So that's it for this. I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Duncan. We've got plenty of time for questions. Let's see. So I see a question from Alina. Alina, so can the user input spatially varying flame length data set that comes from somewhere else?
Anything that just matches the resolution of the tree map, so 30 meters.
So this is like generally, something that interests me. So how do you add, sort of alternative models, and for alternative ways to get fire behavior input would be one of those. And maybe we'll hear from Reginald next about their thinking about sort of incorporating multiple models into Yes, but yeah, any thoughts about that?
Well, I just think, yeah, that was sort of the whole idea for FTDIS originally, I think, was to try and put all the models in a place where people could link them together. And so, yeah, I think would be a great idea to have this whole sort of set of models on one hand. On the other hand, I get nervous because, we're taking FCCS fuel beds as sort of an unknown quantity, and then mapping them when there's a little bit of error involved in that, and then we're predicting flame length from that, and there's a little bit error involved in that, and then we've heard just today about the error involved in just converting flame length to crown scorch. And so there's always that cautionary tale when you start to link a whole bunch of models together. But basically, when you're looking at landscape scale stuff, we don't have a better option right now. And we can always improve this option. At some point, for tree mortality, I can see that we're just going to throw both of them away, and we'll have a totally different model for predicting mortality of trees. But for now, given the empirical data we have, I think linking these models together is the best way to do it.
Right. Yeah. Thanks. Any questions from the? Okay. So let's see from Elena again. Let's see. I've been getting to know the satellite-based fire radiated power data sets. I'm not sure how directly those can be crosswalked to flame length. Would be interested in using this tool for rapid landscape predicting of tree mortality after a fire event. Any comments here?
I think it would be great, but I'm not sure about that radiative power. I don't know how that relates to flame length myself.
Yeah, that's kind of up my alley. Been thinking about that a lot over the years, and it's a real tricky thing. And I think it's to solve that problem, we essentially need. I mean, ideally, you would have information on sort of the flame front dimensions, how much of the pixel you're dealing with is occupied by flaming material. So there's a lot of kind of development on ground measurements that would be required to really make use of fire rated power measurements. Energy is going to be more reliable because it's somewhat pixel size insensitive. Just as an idea.
Okay.
But that, of course, is not something that you can get from like Otis and Beers right now because they just don't pass over the fire frequently enough. So it's a lot of opportunity for higher spatial and temporal resolution infrared in the future. And maybe this infrastructure package will lead to that with a small satellite constellation.
Well, that'd be cool.
Yeah. Any other questions? Right. Yeah, I'll just say, I always come back to like predictive infrastructure. That's kind of the way I think about it, like getting high quality, high accuracy inputs to models. And I think I recall Bob Keane, and maybe you were on that paper, just demonstrating how much error. It's sort of like, when you link different data sets and processes together and each of them have errors, it really compounds quickly. So yeah, do you see any major improvements in that in the coming on the horizon? Well,
I mean, I think, I think that there's some promise in the terrestrial LiDAR for the fuels. I don't know that, I'm not sure how we're going to spread that over the landscape. It's pretty small scale, but I think that there is with LiDAR, I think that there's the 3D modeling. What we've seen today, I think is pretty interesting, as far as getting better predictions of crown scorch and that kind of thing. We're always improving everything. And like I said, someday I can see that FOFEM will go away and we'll have a much better tool that really takes these complex processes and makes them complex computations instead of simple computations like we do in FOFEM.
Right. I was just looking to see if anyone from the 3D Fuels project that's funded by CERTIP is on, and I don't see anyone, but if anyone wants to take that question about how you spatially map 3D fuels in a fairly accurate way. That would be interesting. Let's see. Any other questions?
I just have a more general question, Duncan. So when do you think, like, what's the time frame for getting it incorporated into Plan Map?
I think, well, hopefully within the next year.
Okay.
All the parts are there. We can do it. Like I said, the fuel consumption and emissions are already in there. It's just standing up the service to create the tree map file is what we need to do.
Right now, do you have to use the tree map from Karen Reilly, or if you have a tree map, could you use your own?
You can use your own, yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, it seems like it's going to be add a lot of functionality to FOFEM to move this spatially. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. So looking ahead, and I hope everyone will join the fire circle afterwards. You know, one of the topics related to decision support or a question I always have is, like, how does that whole ecosystem work from research to decision support? You know, is it functioning well? You know, how could, I don't know, it's maybe the pipeline and the feedbacks between research and decision support. You know, how is that working? There was a really nice idea in the initial IFTDIS about having a sandbox where you could, you know, researchers could come and bring their models to compare with what IFTDIS is predicting, and just have a way to, you know, judge whether something's an improvement or not, and kind of a way to foster collaboration is also. So just some comments. I don't know. Yeah. Any perspectives on how those feedbacks and that sort of pipeline from research to decision support is working? Duncan?
Well, I feel like it tends to be a pretty narrow pipe, that there's a lot of research and there's a lot of need for the tools, and the connection between the two is sometimes pretty tenuous. And so that's why I just, you know, I encourage folks to, you know, whatever work they're doing that might improve models that managers use, you know, communicate with the folks that are doing that. And I think Reggie is going to, maybe he'll probably talk about some of this, especially your sandbox idea, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot, Duncan. And we're at 10:20. So Reggie, if you're ready, please go ahead. I called you Reggie. I don't know if you go by Reginald. Sorry.
No, it's actually Reggie. My mama gave me the name Reginald, so I have to answer to it, but everyone calls me Reggie.
Got it. Thank you.
No doubt. Let me get everything pulled up for everybody and we'll get this party started. Yeah, that was a fast transition, wasn't it? I was prepared, but not prepared all at the same time.
Yeah. It's complicated technology.
Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yep, see it well.
All right, fair enough. Hi, my name is Reggie Goolsby. I work for the U.S. Forest Service, part of the Wildland Fire Management RDNA. Work with Duncan, as he alluded to before, and I'm one of the co-leads on the Fire Modeling Services Framework. The name of this presentation, we just call it Life with Fire, Next Generation IT Fire Modeling. The Fire Modeling Service Framework is a model as a service structure where basically all the models are maintained and managed and upgraded in a seamless fashion without impact to end users. What this does is it ensures consistent outputs across all analytical systems and provides the need to manage, it no longer provides the need to have to manage internal modeling infrastructure of your own applications. For instance, if you have IFTDIS and you have WFDIS, one of our interagency fuel treatment decision systems that was mentioned earlier, and the Wildland Fire Decision Support System, instead of now both those applications having to manage models, making sure that they always have the latest version and so forth, now they're all managed and housed in one consistent location. So the same model you run in IFTDIS is actually the same model you run in WFDIS or any other decision support system that's connected to us. We also provide an intersection with other services and the components that actually need to run them. So we just didn't throw a modeling service out there without thought about what about the data and points to connect to it. So we have partnered with the Fire Environment Mapping System, also known as FEMS, and as far as landscape, to create a landscape product service, as well as the weather fire environment mapping system, Climatology API. That's a lot to say all at one time. So where are we now? So going into 2022, it is December, almost January. We are at this current point, we can run a fire model, any computation intensive process, not just fire models. You can run them from anywhere. We have a limited capacity, so it's no longer one of those scenarios where you can only run maybe 1 or 2 models at a time, and you got to place them in a queue because it's consuming a certain amount of resources. You can run an infinite amount of models at a time concurrently. Mentioned earlier, we working on streamlining the way to progress research from the lab to the end user. We really want to help facilitate that, with the stuff that Duncan's working on and getting into these decision support systems into the hands of people who can actually use them and make meaningful decisions off of them. Our SLA is 99% uptime because I couldn't write 100. They wouldn't let me because nothing's 100%, but we are fault tolerant and failover safe. What we do is technology transfer in the literal sense. We're transferring technology. I know that term also sometimes includes doing educational stuff, but we are literally transferring analytics and technology from one location to the next. All right, freezing on me. So what are we? We are a group. So when I say fire model services framework, just don't think that we're just one entity. We are nothing without our partners. One of my other colleagues came up with this diagram with the octopus, and the idea was that there's so many tentacles with the fire model services framework, where it's the land fire service, whether it's FEMS, and everyone's interconnected in this ecosystem that we have. And like the orange box is supposed to represent the ecosystem where like a lot of us have one foot into it, another foot somewhere else. And it's because of that, we're able to tie so many different services together. So what can you expect if you were to actually use the fire modeling services framework? Well, you would be in the middle. You would be with this, if this fire lab or any other application that's connected to us. You would go to the land fire product services to actually get your landscape data and your fuels data. You would go to FEMS to get any kind of weather information you may need to accompany that data. You would then send that data to the fire model service framework. We would process your model, and then we return those results to you. In the olden days, for those who have used WFDIS or IFTDIS in general, you always got to wait in the queue. So if a bunch of people are running models, it could take a while before they get to yours. You no longer have that issue. We process your model as soon as you get it. We don't have the issue of having to wait. So as I was alluding to, so how would user interact with this? It's interacted with via other applications. We are a service. We don't provide a GUI. We don't provide a place to come to the fire modeling services framework to run these models, but we do give you a way to interact with them through APIs. One way you could do it now would be IFTDIS and WFDIS. They have incorporated fire modeling services framework. They also are plugging into the landscape service as well as the FEMS Climatology API. What will you see in these different applications? For them, you still feel like you're in their application. What you're going to get is improved performance, consistent inputs and outputs. What you have, the same models that WFDIS is running, could be the same models that IFTDIS is running versus application A, B, C, or D. You're going to get no queuing of analysis. We can process them on the fly. As soon as you send them, you get faster results because you don't have to wait. It also allows for rapid DME as application developers. Now, if I'm running an application, I don't have to worry about maintaining the infrastructure that's required to run these models. I can plug into the service. I can focus on providing my users the capability to actually act on the outputs of those models. Application that currently connected to us, we got IFTDIS, NextGen should be connecting next year. We're going to, the Duncan is currently in it. He's using it. We have other people from the Fire Lab that are in the pending account status. We're waiting till we go to production in March or spring 2022. And we're going to have limited availability in the spring, but we're really looking forward to having general availability by next fall, fingers crossed. So just some backup history, it was referred to earlier. Fire Model Service Framework, it was a holdover from the Joint Fire Science Scientific Modeling Playground. It was the original concept started there. We took it and kind of put our own little spin on it. We prototyped it. It started in the ISTIS application. It's now since been split off to its own entity. It's no longer part of ISTIS. It's its own product, but we started in ISTIS to prototype of how we could do this via a REST API. We incorporated the Flam map models, basic MCT, and then we started working with RANDIG and FCONST. We partnered and helped FEMS as well as the Land Fire Service build the weather and landscape services that accompany it. And we also helped them develop shape and LCP edit projects. So now in the landscape service, you can actually edit your LCPs in the Land Fire Service. So you don't even have to have your own editing services anymore. If it is actually, since I actually sent this presentation in, they will be plugging into the service in December. If you're in IFTIS, you're probably going to get a notification saying that it's going to be offline December 10th to the 16th. When it come back up, you will be using the Fire Modeling Services Framework. That happened after I sent this, so it's not actually in there. We have worked internally to build custom GUIs to actually help facilitate showing exactly what an API is and how it works. Over the past year or so, we've completed RANDIG, Basic MTT, Farsight FS Pro. We actually help people improve the SCP edit projects. We actually help ISTIS integrate. And we actually work with other contractors and other government entities that kind of help deliver some proof of concepts for their products as well. Our partnerships, well, I got to go back to just the Land Fire Product Services. They've been fantastic. They actually developed a REST API that is available to the public. We help them build that for us, but for everyone else can use it using multi-band geotiffs, where you're able to resample those products to different resolutions, specify the output projections, and edit them in real time. They're available to anybody. They're also fault tolerant in testing. We actually help them test their and build their environment and their architecture, and they're tested against the same criteria as we are. And it's compatible with the Fire Model Services Framework out of the box. Any landscape that you create from the Land Fire Service will work with us. It was designed that way. Running out of time. We mentioned that we're allowed to do landscape edits and so forth. The fire environment mapping system, I'm also actually the lead on the co-lead on the climatology API. There we're developing a REST API and a GraphQL API, as well as spatial data services to applying hourly NFDRS weather odds and 7-day forecast and graded weather projects. Matt Jollis, the other lead on that project. So we're working on that as you speak. A lot of these products will be available to the public through NIST open data or behind FEMS federated user accounts just due to security policies. But again, the FEMS API, climatology API is built against the same criteria as the Fire Modeling Services Framework. And anything you get from FEMS will be compatible with the Fire Modeling Services Framework. In the future, FEMS are also going to provide forecast data, observation data from grids, and they already provide RAWS endpoints that's currently in WIMS. Future partnerships. We're open to options. I love new friends. That's just we're very opinionated in how we require you to build your applications. We're very opinionated on the support time, SLA agreements, and so forth. You're going to be required to go through the same rigorous testings as we put ourselves through. We have a higher standard than I believe any other application in wild and fire that I'm aware of, and we pride ourselves on that. And we're not willing to budge from that. But yeah, we would love to work with anybody who think they have a model or a data source they would love to see in the Fire Model Service Framework. My contact is at the end. So the future is now, in my opinion, and this is going to get more into the architecture standpoint so you can understand exactly what kind of standards you'll be held to. Whenever someone requests a model for us, those models are actually created and run on demand. Right now, if there's no request in that's been sent to the Fire Model Service Framework. There are no servers provision nowhere in AWS. And as you make a request, create your own special environment, run your model, then we decommission that environment and we store that data for you for a short time. If you don't download your data in like 7 days, we delete it. But because of that, we have an infinite amount of capacity. The more you send, the more we can run. We have more failover capacity. If a data center fails over or fails, we're actually designed so we can fill up to another region or to another availability zone. We're fully integrated with AWS. There's no way of moving this out of AWS. We couldn't go to Azure or anywhere else. It was done that by design because we need to be fully scalable and able to do things that we had to take advantage of resources to AWS that was proprietary to them. We're failover safe. We're deployed through the AWS Edge network. We have zero downtime deployments. We have deployments that are done that where if a build fails, it will roll back and the client actually has no impacts to it. We have asynchronous modeling. We all know modeling takes time. So when you create a request, you get an ID back. Then of course, you poll the service when it's done, you can download it. And we can run these without impacts to other systems. The core models we have now is Farsight, basic MDT Randig, FS Pro, and as Duncan mentioned earlier, SpatialFOFEM that is in the Fire Modeling Service Framework. We do have some developer tools. I say these are developer tools because these are not GUIs. We do provide a Swagger interface, and we will have a Postman collection on our documentation site once we get it up. It's not online right now. So going into the future, what are our future plans? We are developing a FMSF SDK, and the idea of that is we want to standardize the way the models are developed and implemented into the Fire Modeling Service Framework. As of right now, each model, when it gets incorporated, is kind of done each individual as a custom, and we realize that that's going to become unmaintainable as we progress beyond the original suite of models that we have. So we need to standardize some things. We're working on that. Due to cost, we can't run models for everybody in the world. I know we're all taxpayers, but my budget isn't that big. So we're going to offer a community, well, we're talking about this. We have not talked to all the scientists because we need to definitely socialize this a lot more, but we're wanting to offer a community version of the Fire Model Service Framework. Whereas in no different than a lot of open source projects, you have like the actual cloud version, then you have an open source version that you can run locally or mirror in your own environment. We would like to do the same. And because of that, because of budget concerns, these models do cost money every time you spool up a server. It's not free. And so like the more models you run, the more it costs. So the costs are actually fluctuating. We just can't give an account to anybody. We want to do is make a community version available that is identical to the one we have online and allow people to actually deploy it themselves. We're going to continue to add additional fire models. We're in talks with some about custom data uploads. I heard that on the previous presentation, a question about that, and as well as looking to partner with more entities. If you do have questions, Henry Baxter, he's our project manager, one of the best ever. And the lead for that is me, Reggie Goolsby, or Reggie, and Nicole Valiant. Partners, I'd like to thank Duncan and our partners with that, and that's the Fire Lab, USDA, Department of Interior, and so forth. Open for questions. That was a lot, I apologize.
Great, but you did it within 15 minutes. So there's plenty of time for questions. It's a lot of exciting stuff going on.
Hey, Reggie.
Go ahead.
Hey,
that was a great presentation, and I like the unlimited capacity. That's going to be a huge game changer for fire analysts on incidents. And thanks for explaining how it happens. I mean, have you guys thought about when this goes live with WFDS, how you're going to keep idiots like me from running 107-day FS Pros and racking up a big bill, or I don't know.
Since WFDS pays half the bill, we don't really tell them what they can and can't do, as long as they pay the check. So they will control you because they're paying half the bill. But as far as we're concerned, we don't care.
Okay.
I have a similar, oh, go ahead, Alicia. I have a similar follow-on. I was curious about WFDS and maybe like Alicia, I don't do 107-day FS pro runs, but I'm guilty of setting up 5 or 6 STFBs all at once, which sometimes causes some ire. Maybe I can do that now.
Yeah.
But is WFDIS planning to entirely migrate to this platform? And then I'm curious, there's obvious reasons for archiving the WFDIS runs or having them where other analysts can see them. So is there's some place where those will live instead of getting deleted after 7 days?
So current gen WFDIS, so don't look for this next summer in WFDIS. We had a conversation with them. They will not, current gen WFDIS in its current state will not be migrating in 2022. Next gen WFDIS, which is slated to come online fall of 2022, will be fully integrated with the Fire Monitoring Service framework. We do not store data longer than 7 days, so each application would be, it's upon themselves to download and cache that data. So that would be up to the WFDIS team to decide how they make that the data available to others within their system.
Thanks.
But yes, you can fire off 4, 20, or 100 short models as you want. Fire away, Karen. I'll let Sam call you.
Oh, and he will.
Yeah, he will.
Great. Any other questions? There's none in the chat. Speak up if you got some, want to follow up. Yeah. So the this playground or sandbox that I've heard about for a number of years, you all are that. It sounds like that's the Fire Modeling Services Framework community version. Is that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So yes, that's in the plans. I was hesitant to put that slide in, but I was like, let's just go for it. I'll deal with the fallout later. We just can't give away people's. I know I just can't take everybody's work and give it away. So like there's some stuff that has to be done, but we do plan or want to create a community version that if, for instance, if you have your AWS environment or can run Docker on your computer, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to run this on your local computer, barring your own, computational limitations, or in your own AWS environment, barring you pay the bill at the end of the month. So that's my vision. That's our vision. Of course, a lot of people probably hearing this for the first time going, they haven't talked to me about that. And it's true, but we're working on that part. There's a lot of nuances to it. Technologically, it's easy. It's the nuances that needs to be worked out.
Got it.
One last question, Reggie. How confident do you feel in AWS being there 100% of the time?
Me personally, so I'm biased. I am a professional certified AWS solutions architect. So I'm going to say I'm all in regardless. There is some apprehensions about others. Not everyone, actually no one feels as confident as I am about AWS, but I always tell people this: if AWS goes down, we got bigger issues than running fire models.
Copy.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Reggie. And I'm, looking forward to hear more about you all's work as time goes on. And so just want to encourage everyone to join the Fire Circle that's going to start up in 20 minutes or so. And thanks to all the speakers. I really appreciate your work you put into your presentations, and great set of talks. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Reggie.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks to all of our speakers for sharing their expertise. This session will be available in Whova, our conference app, within 2 weeks after the Congress ends. Up next, we have a 20-minute break followed by 5 general sessions, 1 special session, and 2 Fire Circle discussion sessions. To choose the one you'd like to join, use the Agenda tab to the left of the screen and click Sessions. Click the main session title to join. To join this session offering Spanish and Portuguese interpretation, be sure to select the session titled Fire Behavior. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks all.